Well, that's an absolutely filthy gearbox. That's exactly what you don't want to see when you pull your cover. That's nasty. Hey guys, how's it going? So the first step is you got to remove your diff cover, and you'll need a good set of female torque sockets. And under your diff cover, pull the bolts. Originally the plan was only to remove the diff cover and change to an LSD, Quaife LSD. So that's what I started off to do here. And as soon as I pulled the cover, I noticed everything's completely black, and which isn't normal. So I thought, you know, so once you pull your diff cover, you pull the drive shaft seal, and that's your diff adjustment shim. It sets up your clearances, and as you can see here, everything's, like I say, black, quite dirty. And I look inside and you'll see the spider gears are all completely chipped. You'll see in a second. Yeah, there you go. Every single tooth is chipped up. So that's a no-go. That's like an alarm bell going off right there. And it's a standard open diff on a Vauxhall Astra VXR. So then I'm just having a look over it, checking the bearings, etc. Put it back in, just have a feel for the bit of lash and whatnot. Normally you can do that with the diff, with the gearbox still in the car. You can change the diff out on these M32s, which is one of the few good things about them. But because I had my motor out, I was doing it in the thing, so there's more like sludge and grind build up. It's pretty nasty. I mean, all these are like bad signs, bad signals. You don't want to see this kind of thing when you pull your diff cover. And that's the diff magnet. It's like, again, full of metal filings and things that's picked up, bits of the teeth and bearings or whatever. So I'm just pulling the crown wheel off here. So that's the crown wheel removed, and just having another look inside, and the spider gears are completely knacked. Like everything's loose, it's just nasty. And that's the Quaife box. Pulling the Quaife out, having a look at the Quaife diff. And that's it there. It's the auto torque biasing diff. So because of all the like nasty, that's the second magnet from inside the gearbox housing itself. And again, that looks nasty. So the whole gearbox is black and burnt and metal filings all through it. So yeah. And that's the LSD with the new bearings pressed on. So to do the gearbox rebuild, you're going to need access to a press at minimum. So as far as fitting the Quaife diff, that's pretty much it. You've just got to get the diff, press on the new bearings, and swap the crown wheels over. That's what I'll do now. So that's the crown wheel nice and clean. That's how they should look, not completely black and burnt up. Crown wheel goes back on there the same way you pull it off. The Torx bolts, but are Loctite. Yeah, so that's the crown wheel on. Yeah, so just Loctite them on, do them up. I think I'm 25 Newton meters or 20 Newton meters. I just kind of buzz them up with the impact gun, not crazy tight. Put your bearing shells back on, and that's the shim for the diff to control the backlash. And normally you'd be alright just using the original one, but when you do put your diff, slot your diff back in and put the shim back in its original position, it does pay to measure the backlash. And a good rule of thumb is 4 to 7 thou, or 1 to 1.5 millimeter backlash, and you want to measure that about 3 times around the circumference. You don't want to just measure it in one spot, measure it at 3 separate spots to get an average. And here we go, I've pulled the lay shafts out, just checking the bearings, and it's all no good. The bearings are heavily pitted and had chips taken out of them and whatnot. So I couldn't reuse the gearbox like I was hoping to. So basically everything needs to be stripped now and full rebuild. So yeah, everything's the same thing. Black, burnt, nasty, whatever. Everything's gotten, you can see it's gotten hot. I think it's the original oil, and this is one of the lay shafts. You just strip down. Yeah, it's completely dirty. Those are the oil galleries you can see in the center. And I'm just removing the snap ring here. I've only got external circlip pliers. I don't have actual snap ring pliers, so it's quite tricky. You slip off a lot more. But it's just what you got to do if you don't have the exact tooling. Can be done. I've done it all okay in the end. That's the hub. So basically you just take things off in order, lay them out in the order you take them off. That just keeps it simple, stops you getting like any confusion or anything like that. Yeah, basically you're just trying to keep things as easy for yourself, because there's no it's hard to find diagrams and like things, and it's easy. And if you're recording yourself or take pictures as you do it, it makes it much easier. This was the first M32 I've rebuilt at this stage, so it's not as hard as you might think either. As long as you've got access to a press and you've got experience using a press, like pressing out wheel bearings, etc., or have someone who has a bit of experience do it with you, and you'll be okay. So yeah, that's kind of as I've pulled the hubs off and the gears off, etc., just lay them out like that onto a mat or a towel and just clean them as you go. And you'll use the puller to get the first one off, and then the rest of them, it was just much easier using a press, because my puller was a very cheap one, and it just basically it stripped itself, and it was, yeah, wasn't very good. It's quite weak. And yeah, I'm just showing you each gear and hub. Shift, sleeve, synchro, gear, hub, and yeah, and that's your 6th gear. And this is the input shaft, and that's got the Allen head bolts, which has to be undone, which is Loctited in. It's quite a strong Loctite, so I'd say use a little bit of heat to melt the Loctite. Usually heat it up to 300 degrees or a heat gun, and that'll you'll be able to undo the bolt much easier. I just buzzed it out from cold, which is really hard work. So yeah, a little bit of heat, try to melt the Loctite a bit on the bolt and then undo it. And then your best bet after that is actually using the press. Thread the bolt back in halfway, and then use the press and that on the gear, and that pushes the bearing off. I did attempt here with the with this puller set here to try and just pull it straight off, but it's just not man enough. It's not strong enough to get the bearing, etc. off. But I've never done it, so I thought I'd give it a go. Yeah, just didn't have the grunt. So yeah, that was a bit of a failed attempt. So yeah, just a simple 20-ton press. You can do all of this stuff with no bother. It's like effortless almost. And because I don't have a press in my little workshop, so I actually went down to I've tried one workshop and they were like, no, we don't let people use it. Then I tried a smaller workshop and they were like, yeah, go ahead, no problem. So I just took all my parts down and cracked on with the disassembly and assembly later on. And yeah, this puller was kind of just coming apart and the legs were coming out and things. It just wasn't very good. So yeah, and that's the lay shaft completely stripped and cleaned. And that's how oil is forced up. Oil's forced up that hole there, and as soon as the crown wheel spins, and that's just showing you how much. That's with one swipe with a screwdriver with a rag up the inside of that lay shaft, and that's the shift sleeve, and you can see that the aluminium and grindings and filings all embedded in the teeth on the shift sleeve. Yeah, it was a really nasty gearbox inside. And that's just the little bath I made up with some Tupperware container with white spirits. And just clean each part and then lay it back out as you remove them. It's a taper roller bearing gear and the hubs. And they're all cleaned and I'm ready to take them down to use the press. I would have filmed down at the guy's workshop with the camera set, but their workshop is super dark. So that's one there ready and clean, ready to go, assembled with the bearing shells on the next. So that's the input shaft. That's good, ready to go. New bearings on, and I'm running a new 6th gear on these. That's the driven 6th gear there. That's been replaced, just for a to give it a longer ratio. Yeah. What else? Yeah, that's the old 6th gear there. That's the standard VXR 6th gear, which is quite at 70 mile an hour with a standard M32 VXR 6th gear. I think you're doing around 3,000 RPM. But I've replaced mine with a diesel one, so I'm a bit lower now. And yeah, that's the other lay shaft cleaned internally because all the aluminium lays up inside there. Cleaned, ready for assembly. Those are your pressurized oil holes for each needle roller on the gear, 3 on each lay shaft. And those are the new Timken tapered roller bearings. You can buy the whole set for quite cheap, about 120 quid for a full set of bearings. That's like lay shafts, diff bearings, etc. And for example, that little tray there with that mess is just off those 2 lay shafts when they were stripped and cleaned in the bath of white spirits. So just those 2 lay shafts there made all of that aluminium sludgy stuff came out. And that's all the inputs and lay shafts complete, ready for assembly, cleaned, etc. All the teeth looked good on the gears, but at this point I didn't realise this gearbox 4th gear synchro is actually worn out, which I didn't know at the time. You can check out my other video where I replaced the 4th gear, 3rd and 4th gear synchro hub, and yeah, that's how dirty just the 2 lay shafts were. And you could actually clean them even more and you'd still continue to get small bits of crap off them. So now that's the casing. So now I'm ready to install the bearing shells off the main bearing, off the main tapered roller bearings off the lay shafts. And because I don't have the internal bearing puller slide hammer tool, I use a MIG welder and run a bead of weld around the old shells, and you'll see in a minute how it works. But yeah, and I need to remove those 3 bearing shells off the end of the lay shafts and input shaft. So yeah, that's what I do now. So yeah, just get a MIG, well I've got a little one of them cheap hobby MIG welders, just run a bead of weld on the inside of the bearing shell, and when the weld cools it contracts, so it pulls the bearing shell inward, and the heat soak around the aluminium housing expands the aluminium, so then the bearing basically, you can actually just tap it out or just lightly pry it out. It takes, on aluminium it takes very little effort to get it out, so that's quite good. And yeah, and because I'm running the same shafts etc, I don't have to re-measure my shimming, so it's not an issue. And yeah, that's what I'm just and before you do run the weld, you need to run some kind of non-stick spray to stop the splatter sticking on everything. Yeah, I'm just talking about on the standard M32 casing, which is what this one is, it isn't the uprated one. There's a very little clearance on a couple of the bearings for the oil to like splash feed, which is what I'm saying here. And I'll do a light, like a very small modification when I pull the shell and shim out. And you can see the oil gallery there. That oil gallery into that bearing is that never usually fails. And that's where the oil is kind of splash fed, gravity fed, where it can either enter or exit. And it's only a 1.5 millimeter clearance to get in and out. And that's the pressure fed system there. So now I'm just running the MIG welder onto the bearing shells to remove them. I just spray a little frying pan spray around the casing just to stop the splatter sticking, because if you don't, then when you run the weld, obviously it sticks to all the bits of aluminium, then you've got to really clean it up, and it's quite time consuming to do that. So Jesus, losing my hair there, Jesus, far out. Oh no, that must be bad lighting, that. Oh dear. Okay, yeah, so a couple of pry bars once you welded it, and just work it carefully. You don't need to put much weight on it. You don't want to put much weight on it, because you can, if you do that, you can crack your casings or do some damage. And basically just pulls out like that, no problem. And then same again with the next few bearings, bit of spray, stop the splitter sticking around. And yeah, just wipe it down for excess. Get the earth on there. Go in with a welder, run a little bead around. And like I say, as weld cools, it pulls it in, shrinks the bearing shell, and the heat soak expands the aluminium. It's actually quite a quick process, even doing it live. It doesn't take too long. That one pulled out really quite easy. Those ones pulled out, worked well. That one there was, because of the angle, because it's a deep, you can't get like a flat level angle on it. So I just tip it up and tap it with a hammer there, and it just fell out. So yeah, very little effort again, which is what you want. You don't want to be having to swing off things or bash things about. And now I've got the shims in the back. I leave the shims where they were, measured everything, measured the shims, and I've written the shims on the side of the casing there with a vernier. That's 0.95 mil on that lay shaft, 0.80 on that one. And now I'm just going to do I've done a small modification on the behind that bearing shell there, just to open it up a little bit, open up the gallery a touch, because that one was by far the tightest clearances. just to allow oil to either feed in or escape, whatever it needs to do. It's just to stop oil trapping and cooking. That's all it's for. Well, that's the theory anyway. That's what I was thinking. Obviously you need your shims to go back in the original location, otherwise you'll be changing your clearances and you can mess things up. You can either they'll preload too tight on the bearings, or you might not have enough. The input shaft was the bit thickest shim in general, is the input shaft, 1.1 mil or 1.15. So yeah, if you had the right bearing shell removal tool, then you can assemble it all and check it. Then if you want to adjust, you can just pull the shells straight out again, but I don't have that tool, which is a bit annoying. But I'm not changing anything. I'm using the same casings and the same shafts. And here I'm just cleaning up, wiping everything down, cleaning up before I insert the new bearing shells. And I've just run some paint around that gearbox housing. Use a copper hammer just so you don't damage any bearing shells, etc. Tap it in square and just go around it even. Take your time. You don't want to scratch the face of your bearing shells. And just work it in. All good. Because it's quite cold here, the workshop's pretty cold, everything's a bit tighter. Sometimes you can preheat your casings if you wanted to help give it a bit more clearance, so it goes in a bit easier. But don't have to. Just tap it down. And then I just use the old bearing shell just to take it all the way home, because it sits slightly below the surface. And you'll hear the pitch change. It's quite a dull impact sound, and when you get it something all the way home, the pitch goes more high pitch. You can tell it when it's live, when you can hear it. But yeah, when you're putting things in aluminium casings, you don't want to bash them too hard, because it's only aluminium, you can do damage. And yeah, that's pretty much the process for all of them. And now we're on to the end bearings. I'm just using a little bit of preheat here, just because again it's pretty chilly in that workshop. Just a bit of a heat gun. Expand the housings a touch. Remember to keep your shims in the right location before you put your bearing shells in, otherwise it'll mess you up. And tap your bearing shells in, and again, because of the recess, I can't get a good angle on it, so it's pretty annoying. So now I'm trying to use the hammer on the hammer type setup. It's not working very well. So then I decide I need to modify the hammer to make it work properly, because of the problem there. So yeah, just have to chop the handle off basically. Sometimes you've got to modify tools to make custom things to work properly. Yeah, just buzz it off. And now you've got a nice little copper punch type setup, which works really well actually. And just tapping all the bearing shells in. That's why when you do assemble your bearings, it's important to keep the shells with the bearings so you don't get them mixed up, because it's quite easy to do. Same with your shimming, you want to measure your shims and write on your shims what's for what. And that's just showing you there how when the crown wheel spins, it drives oil up behind the back washer plates and drives oil up through the hole there, and that's pressurized, so it pressurizes your needle roller bearings on the gears. That's why I've never heard of the needle roller bearings or gears failing like that, because they're pressure lubed. It's just the tapered roller bearings at the ends which aren't. Yeah, so the tapered roller bearings basically entirely, the two of them entirely rely on just basically splash fed, so it's not the best setup. And they're quite a small bearing for the amount of load they get. So now I'm just going to do a fit up. So you put everything, all the bearing shells are in, everything is good. Put the input shaft in, and then once you get the input shaft in, then you put your casing on and just put about 5 bolts in. You'll see in a second. Put a bit of oil on the tapered roller bearing before you put it up, because it should be lubricated. That's just a mineral oil, nothing fancy. Yep, put the casing on. Just the input shaft in by itself, nothing else. Put a few bolts in. And just buzz them down. Don't have to be specific on a torque, just nip them up. When I eventually get there. And again, when you work on these, you need a good torque set, male and female torque sockets. Just quickly run them down. And if you've done everything right, you should be able to turn that input shaft by hand. My setup is slightly on the loose-ish side. It should be stiffish to turn by hand. Not basically you want to set it up so there's no plate. You shouldn't be able to move the shaft left or right or in or out. I'm just giving it a tap there with a nylon hammer just to make sure everything's located right. You want to set it up for zero play. And ideally I'd have a little bit more preload on mine, just a touch more. But the gearbox ran like that for 70,000 miles, so it was a hell of a lot looser before I done these setups. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now. And if you put your input shaft in, then put the rear case on, and that input shaft is like, basically you can't turn it by hand, then you've got an issue. Then you've got way too much preload on your bearings. That's when you would need to remove the bearing shell from the end of the casing and put in a thinner shim to increase the clearance, to take the preload off the bearing. Yeah. And now basically I've put in the 2 lay shafts and do the same again, and just you want to be able to turn each shaft by hand. But if you've got your gear selector in and you pick a gear, then it might be quite tight to turn the gear by hand. But because my diff's out, put in a lay shaft, and if you can get your fingers down there onto there like that and turn the gear by hand, it should be slightly stiff. The load, there should be a bit of load on it, nothing crazy. Again, if you've got to swing off it to try and turn them, then there's too much. And I think that's a bit of a big issue with some of these gearboxes from factory. Some of them have been shimmed up way too tight. Like my gearbox was, what I'd say was slightly on the loose side, but the bearings hadn't actually failed. they're just yeah, tapered roller bearings do not like a lot of preload, but they do need a touch, just a tiny bit. So yeah, that's the lathe shaft. I'm just getting them, put a bit of lube on them, put a bit of mineral oil to put them up for assembly. Always lube them up. And yeah, just and basically see behind those two gears there, there's a small opening. That's where the washer is. That's where the crown wheel drives the wheel up when it spins. So when you drive forward, it drives the wheel up behind there and through the lathe shafts. So everything looks pretty good. Like I said, if I had more shims or the right tool for removing that, I would have put a little bit touch more preload on the input shaft. There I'm just putting on a new release bearing, just while you've got your gearbox apart. If your release bearing's done to like 80,000 mile, pay to change it. And now it's kind of like the final assembly. Put the new release bearing on, put a new input shaft seal on, then a new release bearing. And obviously you want to keep things super clean. It's all about cleanliness. When you disassemble, get everything as clean as you can. Pull your shafts in. Just need to put your shift forks on, the selector sleeves. Just putting in the selector forks. I've kind of done it in the wrong order. You sit them on before you drop the shafts in. You kind of figure out the way to put it. They go on as you drop them down. And the fork guides, obviously I put that one in too early because you've got to like kind of put them in the right order, otherwise you don't have enough room to get them back in. Just pays to put oil on everything, any contacting part, just a better safe than sorry. Still mucking about trying to get the shift forks in, selector forks in. And everything that you've done should slide into place without a lot of effort. Like if you think you've got to start knocking things back into place and that, there's probably something wrong. It should all go in by hand. With a bit of a wiggle, should drop down, you know. And now I'm happy with it all. Just going to put this bead of silicone. Oh, don't forget your magnet. That's right. Put your clean magnet in the location, and that'll collect any foreign metal that gets built up or whatnot. And now I'll just put a bead of silicone. I've put the selector mechanism in as well. I just use a black RTV Loctite. It's good to about 150 degrees Celsius. I think continuously as well, so it's perfectly good. And I'm just rubbing off the excess. Takes a bit of time, not very exciting stuff, is it? And then just lower your case on, clean case. And again, this should go on and locate on nicely by hand. Once you locate it on the dowel pins, it should be fine. You don't want to break out the sledgehammer and start knocking things on, obviously. Bolts in. They just all get nipped up. I think I put all mine to about 25 Newton meters. That's probably not 100% correct, but it does the job. And then once you've got them on and torqued down or whatnot, then you need to go through all the gears and make sure you've got all the gears from reverse through to 6th gear. And if you do, and you can still turn it and it all sounds good, that's a good sign. Hey guys, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button for me, it helps me out a lot. And if you want to see other videos and more stuff, please subscribe. Cool, thanks for watching.